We've reached the end of the season of Constellation. This is episode 8, entitled These Fragments I Have Shured Against My Ruin. Welcome back to the channel. My name is Sean Redmond. This is Sean's Take. Welcome back if you've been with us all the way through Constellation. If you're just joining us, I've done this entire series if you want to go back and check out the other episodes. This is a spoiler warning for not only this episode, but the entire season. So if you haven't seen the entire season or this episode, go watch it and then come on back and watch it. I will use clips from the show as is allowed under the fair use provision of the copyright laws of 1976. Before we dig in, a little full disclosure. There was an interview given by the show creator, Peter Harnett, unequivocally stated that there are two and only two realities. That the two realities are mirrors of each other, and there is liminal space, giving us a total of 3 places to be. So if we sum it up in what we've talked about in extent, there is the one where the wounded angel is facing the door. There's the one where the devil by the pot is facing the door. And then there's the one where they're mixed up, which is the liminal space. Speaking of the devil by the pot, I also did discover that the reason some people call the painting Devil by the Pot by the name Changeling is because in the show, they refer to a folktale book called The Changeling that uses the painting Devil by the Pot as its cover. I'll try and find the image where we saw that and put it here. So it is sort of both. The painting that hangs on the wall is called Devil by the Pot, but the cover of the book is The Changeling. I'm glad we figured that out because I didn't understand why they would not know the name of that painting. And in fact, they're referring to, or Alice refers to the book and the painting as the cover of the book because she's either 9 or 11, depending on which reality you're in. Okay, so into where are we? Oh, it does, just to touch on the two realities. I postulated that there were at least 4, maybe more, because of the scene where we had Alice with the Fisher-Price tape deck blue reality in the cabinet, and Alice with the tape deck red reality in the cabinet, and then Joe looking in a cabinet that only had the tape deck and no Alice, Magnus looking in a cabinet that had only a tape deck and no Alice. Those 4 places seem to be happening concurrently, which would lead to 4 realities. It does become true, though, that we are talking about a 2-year offset to 2021 and 2023. So maybe they were in the liminal space 2 years apart. Anyway, I'm not going to let it ruin the show. It's just a point in the show that I got lost in. Sorry, I took you with me. But talking about this stuff is why it's fun, and then finding out the truth. So now that we do know that there's 2, we have a basis to discuss. So in this episode, we open with what really does appear to be an homage or an homage to Stanley Kubrick's movie The Shining, with the aerial shot of the ambulance driving down the road is almost identical to the opening shot of The Shining, and the music that's playing is very reminiscent of the music that plays over the opening of The Shining. And that's interesting. It's probably just a salute. I have heard that Stephen King is a fan of Constellation, but Stephen King was not a fan of Stanley Kubrick's ending of the movie. So it would be interesting if the idea is that the Overlook Hotel where The Shining takes place was actually liminal space. That's going to be a different video. Let's get into this one. So it's the ambulance taking Joe, against her will, to Irina's sanitarium for crazy astronauts. Because she won't take her pills, and she's kidnapped her daughter and stolen NASA property, and burned down a cabin, as it turns out. So as they bring her in the on the stretcher into the hospital, she looks at the one nurse who looks like a nun, and then she looks at the nurse on the other side, and it's Irina dead from the other reality in the cosmonaut suit. And she doesn't completely freak out. They take her and they hook her up and put the mouth guard in her mouth, and they begin electric shock. And as they're doing the electric shock, we flash to the space station. So maybe Joe flashes to the space station, and the power is flickering in places on the space station. Okay. They stop. We cut to Bud Caldera waking up in the snow. So I'm going to say that the thing in the snow that I pointed at saying that's Bud Caldera wasn't Bud Caldera, because there's not a chance that all of those first responders just left him laying there. So Bud was somewhere else laying in the snow. And he was laying in the snow but didn't freeze to death, so good for him. He finds the cow and destroys it with an axe. I think his thinking is without the cow, it will be harder for Henry to switch places back. And, Bud knows what Bud did in the other reality and what price Henry is going to have to pay for Bud's crimes. Because as far as Bud knows, he killed Paul, and Henry's going to have to stand trial for 2 murders. Now, so Henry, in the other reality, asks for a polygraph test and a DNA test because he believes that his DNA twists differently than that reality's people. And that would make sense based on what the creator said, that the 2 realities are mirrors. So if we're in the blue universe, I claim the blue universe because of my set, if all our DNA twists, let's say, to the right, then in the mirror reality, it would twist to the left. And he's hoping they see that and let him go. It's kind of optimistic because he's covered in blood. But that's where he thinks the reality is going to get him. But Henry and Bud did not physically change places. They mentally changed places. That's interesting. So we see Irina having the nuns move a piano, because why wouldn't you, into Joe's room. And then she decorates the piano with pictures of Alice and Magnus. Interesting. We see them do an ultrasound of Joe, on Joe. And Joe's pregnant. And the nurse says the image is corrupt. And we see the picture and we know what that is. The ultrasound is showing the sort of double, I almost said double helix, but it's not a helix. It's, that sort of butterfly cowl effect. If you happen to hear what sounds like howling, it's very windy and my window is complaining. I don't know if the microphone's going to pick it up. If it does, that's what it is. And I'm sorry. I'll try and clean it up in post. So we see that cowl image in the ultrasound. So they electric shocked her when she was pregnant. Probably not good for the fetus. Joe wakes up and turns on the light. I think it's interesting that her left eye was towards the light when she turned it on, and it bothered her a lot, and she turned it off. Or at least the way they shot it, I have to say, a hand turned it off. I don't know if we didn't see her reach back up and do it. There wasn't anybody else in the room. But I think there's a little bit of room in what we learn later in this show that possibly somebody else turned it off for her. But we'll say the light was turned off and she was left in the dark. A nurse opens the door and Joe starts speaking to her in a rapid succession of languages, trying to find one the nurse understands. And the nurse just leaves. Irina comes in, and they do the light test on Joe's eyes. And Joe's right eye dilates and contracts normally. Her left eye is completely unresponsive. Although she never says she can't see out of it, it's not reacting like an eyeball should. And there's a very definite reason for it. Stick around, because in case you missed it, I'm going to tell you exactly what it is, because there's no doubt in my mind what it is. So Irina tells her that she's pregnant and that they can't give her lithium anymore because it'll kill the baby. So they've come up with an alternate drug therapy for Joe, which Joe rejects. And Joe grabs Irina's arm and sees her as the cosmonaut and realizes it's her. She's the woman that hit the space station. She's the dead cosmonaut. She's the Valia that's been haunting Alice's nightmares. And she starts quoting in Russian what Valia said on the tape that as she was crashing, as she was dying, that the world was mixed up, upside down. Irina leaves disturbed and calls Henry/Bud, who's, he doesn't know what he doesn't know. So he agrees to meet her. In the other reality, Henry Caldera undergoes the polygraph, which he passes with flying colors, because he really didn't shoot Paul and he really didn't throw Ian, his name is, over the ship. He does admit, though, in the conversation, he admits that while he didn't shoot Paul, he was probably responsible for Paul's death because he created the device that allowed the accident on the space station to happen. It's an interesting statement, because we're going to talk about that more in a minute. We see Joe gets a visitor, Ilya, her team member from her time on the space station, and the one that talked to her rationally when she was sort of venting crazy, and he went to look up the medical records, Ilya. So he comes to see her here, and she explains to him what she thinks. And he tells her that she has astronaut burnout, that other people have had it, that it is medicatable, and she needs to cooperate. She explains that, there's a version of Irina that's dead in the other reality. There's a version of her in the other reality that's dead. There's a version of Paul that's alive. And Ilya says, the most straightforward reason for you and her being here is that you both return safe. And then he goes, and it seems like he's cutting ties. And he begs her one more time to do the right thing. Turns out that as he did that, he took her hand and gave her keys. Because he really is her friend. We see Magnus talking to the psychologist or the psychiatrist or the doctor. And they edited it pretty well. That's hard to say, edited it. But the editing was done very well, except that I caught it because I was ready by now. We're 8 episodes in, where his shirt changed. They only showed him tight at the top, but you saw that his shirt was different. And I wasn't sure what they were going to tell us. And of course, then they blatantly showed us at the end. They show us from behind the doctor that Magnus is sitting in both chairs. So we're seeing not really the liminal state. They're not both actually there. They can't see each other. We're just seeing both realities, that this is happening in both realities simultaneously. That was interesting. And I think that was to prepare us for the thing that happens in a minute. So Irina meets Henry. But it's not Henry, it's Bud. And Bud, I noticed, nothing came of it yet. But Bud has been eating since the transfer. And they've made a point of us seeing him eat. Now, I'm not sure if when you're in the wrong reality, things don't taste right. And he's back, so he's eating everything. Or if this is just a character thing. Or if it means something. Maybe we'll find out in season 2. Fingers crossed. So during that conversation, sitting at the table, Bud tells the story of hearing the story of the cosmonaut that died in space. And he never met her. And then he admits that he's not Henry, that Henry is somewhere else. So that's, she wants to get him back on the lithium, cool him out or whatever it is. And I think she also knows that he's capable of a lot. So Joe, getting back to Joe, I think she decided to leave, and she uses the keys to get out of her room, and she has her coat on, and she's heading out, and she hears the other astronaut. They talked about the other astronaut that was there, incurable, and she decides to go see. And she opens the hatch on the door, and when she looks in, she sees 2 old men that look like twins, and the one calls her mommy, which is creepy. She closes it and runs back to her room and stays. The next time she talks to Irina, she says, what about the men upstairs? And Irina says, there's only one man upstairs. She says, who is he? And Irina's response is, he was the first man in space. Now, pump the brakes a little. That is not Yuri Gagarin, who in our reality is acknowledged as the first man in space, because back in episode 3, I think it was, Ilya was telling us of the first man in space. He made it to space, but he didn't make an orbit, and he crashed in China, I think. And that's him. And there is only one of him. And that's sort of the huge thing for Joe, in that when she opened that door, she saw the guy standing there on her right, with her right eye. And her left eye saw the guy that's in the other reality in that cell walking towards her. And she's seeing blue reality with her right eye and red reality with her left eye. That's why she saw 2. And that's why later in the episode, when we see him again playing chess against himself, there's only one. There isn't a twin. And that's huge, because if Joe can see both, and she's pregnant, Alice actually, let's get there. Magnus is selling the Germany house, and he and Alice are packing. And Alice has the Fisher-Price tape deck, and we cut to the other Alice, who also has the Fisher-Price tape deck, which is interesting, because we definitely saw one of them melt. Actually, we saw 2 of them. We saw one of them melt, and the other one freeze and break with Henry, or Bud. So anyway, the magically reappearing Fisher-Price tape deck. Alice wants to know where her mother is, her real mother. And she records it and then plays waiting for the answer. And she calls to Alice and she doesn't answer. And then she finally says goodbye. So the Alice with live Joe says to Magnus that she knows it's all pretend, that they're just stories. Can she go see her mother? And you feel bad for Red Reality Alice because her mother is actually still alive, but she doesn't get her. She gets to think she's dead. So we do see Red Reality Alice speaking to her father, and she says that another Alice somewhere else got her mother, and that she can't be mad at Alice for that. And then she asks her father if she's brave, and of course Magnus says, "I think you're incredibly brave." That's a heck of a thing for a kid to say. And that was a pretty big moment. And they do get in, and they make a point of us seeing them get into the red SUV so that we know that that's the Alice that said it without question. So, hey, you know what? This would be a great time if you're enjoying this so far and you're still with me in this video. Hit that thumbs up to like this video. That'll trigger it to go to more people, expand the channel for me a little bit, and consider subscribing so that you know when I release new episodes for new series. All right, I'm not going to bog you down with everything that's coming up, but keep an eye on the community tab. I'll post things there, and let's get back into this. So Henry in the Red Reality gets the bad news that his DNA is an exact match, which surprises him. But we already talked about the fact that the bodies didn't swap between, so he actually is in the correct body. I am confused a little bit. Let me know in the comments if you think Bud and Henry were in the correct universes until Bud flipped over, right? Or has Bud and Henry returned to their realities of origin? I keep going back and forth as to whether Bud is the hero that saved his crew and Henry's the one that allowed them to die, or if Bud really is the guy that allowed them to die and Henry is the hero. Let me know what you think. Let's sort it out in the comments. So Henry does end up being charged with 2 murders. Well, the murder of Ian Rogers on the boat. He threw over the boat, and the attempted murder of Paul, the astronaut. So Bud Caldera tracks down Ian Rogers in the blue reality, and he is not a reporter, or maybe he is, but among other things, he is a Jack the Ripper tour guide in London, and he's leading a group through all the spots of Jack the Ripper's Whitechapel, and Bud stops him and gives him some flowers and says, "Live your best life, Ian Rogers," and walks away laughing maniacally. So Blue Alice, so we saw Red Alice make her peace with her reality, and now Blue Alice, talking to Joe, says that she's willing to accept her reality and she needs a mama. And Joe says, "Well, I need an Alice." And they agree to be those things for each other. Joe levels with Magnus and says that she's trying to be rational. She's taking the pills so that she can be with him and raise the baby. And he asked if she really wanted the baby. And then she asked him if he really wants her to have the baby. And we don't hear either one of their answers. We see Irina. Oh, while Joe is talking to Magnus, Irina comes out and gives Alice something. I couldn't make out what it was. I assume they're sweets of some sort. And they talk for a moment. And Irina says her name's Irina, Valentina, blah, blah, blah. And then she leans into her ear and says, "But my friends call me Valia." And she immediately stands up and walks back inside. Alice handles that very, very well, I have to say. So that's a little piece of information for her. But I'll tell you what I think that means in just a second. In just a minute, stick around. We see Paul wake up in the hospital, very agitated. And then he looks at both of his hands, surprised to see 2. And that's all we really get of that. Alice does ask Joe that if she's pregnant and Joe's from somewhere else and Dad's from here, where's the baby going to be from? That's an excellent question. Or will it be twins? And now we hear on the space station the tablet recording that Joe made in case she didn't make it back and the tablet was ever recovered for her family. We hear it playing. You'll always be under my eye or in my sight. And it floats down to where the body of Joe is floating in the cupola overlooking the earth. which was not broken. And she floats around and we see damage done to her head. And then her eye moves and looks at the tablet. And she grabs the tablet and the eye turns back to the camera. That's the last we see of her in this season. There is no word yet as to a season 2. Apple TV has not yet greenlit a season 2. I sure hope the ratings were enough. I think it's a great show, and I think everybody in it's doing a really good job. I don't know where we'd go for season 2, but I didn't know where we were going to go for season 1, and that was fun, so it would be okay. It does feel like this show didn't get any marketing, and those of us that found it sort of by accident. Okay, so a couple of things. Joe on the space station is alive-ish. I think that has to do with the electroshock. I think her consciousness may be split because she sees into the other reality with the eye that Joe doesn't have. And Irina seeming to know that Alice knows the name Valia would suggest that when people see the dead cosmonaut sees them too, and that she's aware. It's very, and this whole episode did have a sort of epilogue feel to it. It wasn't quite as intense as the rest, nor should it be. The penultimate episode last week, everything starts to calm down. People start to accept their realities. So if next season we don't have Alice and Magnus in it, we know that they made peace with their reality. Because Alice, the red universe, reality Alice is 9 years old. Blue Alice is 11. There's a 2-year difference. Well, when we ever get around to filming another season, those 2 girls are twins. They're going to grow up. So we'll see what happens. What do you think? I thought it was a great ending. I thought it was a good series. We had enough answers that I'm not angry at the season finale. And we have enough unanswered questions to catapult us to season 2, which we better get. So I am going to be picking up Star Trek Discovery's final season coming up. I'm torn whether or not to do the Acolyte. It is Carrie-Anne Moss, so that will interest me. I know they've already scrapped their season 2, so that's only going to be the one season, and it's undergoing a lot of controversy, and it hasn't even aired yet. There's a couple other things coming up, like Fallout. Looks like it might be interesting. What's the black and white one? It's called. There's a black and white one. I'll post it in the community. See if everybody wants to watch it. But that's it for this season. Please, subscribe so you can hang with us for other shows. As I do appreciate you being here. Gives me somebody to talk to. But that's it for now. My name's Sean. This is Sean's Take.